Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to the Schiller Institute Weekly International Webcast featuring our president and founder, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. We're in a very fast-moving strategic situation, a lot of important developments going on. Probably most significant is the coup that was carried out this week in Italy uh, on behalf of the European Central Bank, the European Union, and the City of London. And I think this is very poorly understood in the United States, the broader implications of it. Helga, why don't we start with that?
Yes, I think it is a traumatic situation because you had a majority vote of the Lega Nord party and the Five Star Movement party. And then the president of Italy basically refused a government proposed by these two parties because in it they had a proposal for an economic and finance minister, Paolo Savona. Now, Savona is an establishment figure. He has been the head of Confindustria, the Industrial Association of Italy. He was a minister in a previous government. He was working in the Bank of Italy. And he was pro-Euro in the beginning. So only after he saw what the terrible consequences for the Italian economy and society were of the EU and especially Eurozone membership for Italy, he turned into a Euro critical person, a so-called Euro skeptic. And he said that the Euro is dictating terms to Italy like it was done with the Versailles Treaty of 1919, which was a complete debt jail for all the nations who were affected by it. Now, he also said that therefore Italy needs a plan B, and that basically he also made, however, totally clear before this question of his possible becoming a minister came up, that he was not intending to leave the euro, that he just wanted to negotiate better conditions, to stop the austerity, to have investment in the real economy, and that he wanted to renegotiate the Maastricht Treaty Stability Pact together with the other affected South European nations. But that was obviously too much for Brussels. They absolutely exerted pressure, especially Draghi was mentioned in the Italian media, but also Brussels in general. They pressured Mattarella, the president, to basically refuse this. Now, this is incredible. Here you have an elected majority by the people, and when Mattarella made a speech where he announced why he could not agree to this new government, he said that it was because the person of Savona would worry foreign investors. Now, this has caused a complete scandal, first of all, but it also has caused a complete backlash because, such a blatant the democracy has been demasked as not existing in the Eurozone. Now, this is not the first time this happened. Already in 2011, German Chancellor Merkel and French President Sarkozy asserted similar pressure to get Berlusconi squeezed out of office. And that then led to the Monti government, which increased the austerity and dramatically increased the economic hardships in Italy ever since. Now, the Italian situation is desperate and the people are upset. And what now is very likely that after they tried a technocrat government, Cottarelli, but then they made a poll in the parliament only to find that Cottarelli would get 0 votes, that not even the Democratic Party, which lost the election, would dare in this climate to vote for him, but would abstain. So it would have ended with what they call in Italy bruta figura, losing completely the reputation for Mattarella if he would have gone along. So now the rumors are and the options are to again try to form a coalition government between the Lega and the Five Star Movement. If that happens, early election will take place. It could be as early as September or October. I don't think it's realistic, end of July, because then every Italian is in vacation. Then the likelihood is that these parties will increase their vote because of what just happened. So it has completely boomeranged and backfired at those people who tried this coup. But it is really discrediting democracy, or rather the EU. And now it is coming out that they already tried the same thing with the Austrian government, except that the Austrian president, van der Bellen, flatly refused such an intervention. But so are the tactics of Brussels, and obviously they are completely against the interest of the membership countries, and this is becoming increasingly clear.
Really outstanding in the hypocrisy is that here you have people who say that we have our traditions, our democratic traditions, and yet here you have a vote. What's more democratic than a vote, which gave a majority to two parties, which were then denied the right to form a government because it went against what the bankers and the markets wanted? That's why it's correct to call it a coup. And it's very similar to what we're seeing with Russiagate in the United States, where the establishment doesn't like the direction of the president, so they try to get rid of him. Now, Helga, I want to explore a couple aspects of the economics here, because I think this is really critical for people to understand. The austerity regimes supposedly are designed to reduce the debt, but actually it has the opposite effect, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean Italy was a country which had no foreign debt before it joined the euro, but with the application of the Maastricht rules, Italy is now, I mean, they are in a terrible economic situation. They have basically, for example, if you take one typical parameter, the youth unemployment, I think there are about 50% of the Italian youth who have neither a job nor an education. Now, there is a phenomenon that 2 out of 3 young people in the age between 18 and 34 years old are still living at home because they cannot afford to have an own apartment. They are called the mamoni, the mama children. Now, this has led, among other things, to the situation that Italy, which is after all still a Catholic country, has the lowest birth rate of all of Europe. So, it has a demographic curve which is rapidly collapsing. And, young people who are living at home can't afford to marry, can't afford to have an own household. Many middle-level industrialists committed suicide. The whole economic condition, in the health system is terrible. People, have no more support for all kinds of medical things. So I think, the people are turning to these parties which are, criticizing these austerity policies and are promising to implement Glass-Steagall, because this is not only in the party program of the two parties, but it is also in the coalition treaty, as well as the creation of an investment bank for investment in production. So while these parties are problematic in some respects, they have problematic people in them. So I'm not saying that this is a wonderful outcome, but it is clearly more reasonable than what the Brussels policy right now is. And as you can see, there is right now the attempt of real financial warfare against Italy. Moody's, for example, on the 25th of May, threatened to downgrade the Italian debt, which is already 2 notches above junk level only. And basically, they today ordered the review of the 12 largest Italian banks. Now, this has all resulted in the fact that the spread of the debt in respect to Germany or other countries is increasing by 300 points. which is more expensive for Italy to take any loans, and that is just worsening the situation. So, I think it's difficult to say what will happen, because this is now also there's talk about contagion to Spain, to Greece, to Portugal. So I think we are really in a very traumatic situation, and I think people should think, this is a time to reflect. You had funny reactions, terrible reactions, like Oettinger, the EU commissioner. He said the markets will teach the Italians a lesson how to vote. Now, this caused an uproar, and naturally everybody is now pointing at Germany, pointing at Brussels. This has created just a terrible disunity in Europe. And even such people like Paul Krugman or Wolfgang Münchau, rather at the Financial Times, they said this was an awful mistake. The Washington Wall Street Journal said this was an awful mistake, because all it will do is it will lead to an increase of the vote of the so-called populist parties the next time. So I think we are in a very traumatic situation, and I think it's high time to reflect on the need to correct the policies, to correct the neoliberal policy, because if this is not happening, only chaos can result of it, and therefore, the 4 laws of LaRouche are more urgent in the entire transatlantic zone than ever before.
I think also there's a problem when you get commentators and political leaders who respond to the vote of citizens by saying, well, it's ignorant populism, when in fact people are losing their savings, they're losing their homes. When Italy was hit with disasters, including the earthquake, they were told by the EU they're not allowed to rebuild their power stations. Now, Helga, you mentioned the banks. There was a situation not that long ago where a bail-in was conducted in Italy that took away the savings of people. So this is why you have the two parties supporting Glass-Steagall. And as I understand it, and maybe you have a better reading on this, that one of the reasons for the freaked out reaction from Brussels was precisely that the EU constitution doesn't allow Glass-Steagall, and yet the Italians are saying that's what they want to do for the banking system, to make sure the banks serve the interests of the population. Is that part of the problem?
Oh, absolutely. If Italy would implement Glass-Steagall under the EU rules, it would not be possible. So therefore, they would either have to leave the euro or the EU has to change. And that was very, very clear. Also, these two parties are for ending the sanctions against Russia. So they have basically a similar intention to, put the relationship with Russia back on a good track, like it is the case with President Trump. So I think that this thing is not resolved, but I think the reflection that something extraordinary is happening, that is indeed becoming a subject of discussion, not only in Europe, but for example, there was a very interesting comment in the Chinese paper Global Times, where they basically say that this Italian development is a reflection of the crippled Western liberal system. And they say basically that the Western politicians care more for their own political gain than the well-being of their people or the country's development, and they try to cling to power with every means, with slanders, with collusion, with interest groups, even with conspiracies. And then they say, and then they point their finger at the political system of China when China is doing everything to uplift its people, to have development of the country. And then they say they should rather take care of their domestic crisis rather than having stereotypes against China. So I think the fact that the Western liberal, neoliberal model, the geopolitical model, the oligarchical model is in a crisis, is becoming subject of discussion. And, already 3 years ago, when I attended a conference in India, there was a big discussion that the EU has stopped to be a model of to follow, that the way the EU has handled the refugee crisis is just completely horrible, and there is no European unity. I mean, Macron's victory, the election victory of the French president, was celebrated by all the mainstream media that this is the proof, that the pro-European ferment in Europe is coming back. All the anti-European critics, they are on the losing end. But this is not the case, because first of all, Macron depends on German support for his pro-European plans. But there are many voices now in Europe who say we are against the banking union, we are against the common budget, we are against a banking union, because it would mean that the savers of the countries who are doing better, i.e. Germany, would have to pay for those who are doing badly. So Macron's plans are out of the window. They have zero chance to succeed. And obviously, the alternative would be what we have been saying the whole time, that the EU in this form of the Maastricht Treaty was a mistake. The euro was a mistake. Professor Hanke, who was a good economist, unfortunately died a couple of years ago. We were in discussion with him, and even before the euro was introduced, we agreed that the European Union area is not an optimal currency zone, because you have countries which are not developed at all industrially, who are more of an agrarian character, and you have highly industrialized countries. And the promise that it would lead to lessening the diversity of development in Europe was never a realistic idea. Now the diversity is much bigger. The rich are more rich, the poor are more poor. And even an analyst of Commerzbank noted today that the euro is still an experiment which can fail, which is exactly what Professor Hanke had predicted. And I have proposed for a very long time to replace this construct of the Maastricht Treaty with an alliance of sovereign republics in the spirit of Charles de Gaulle, because we can perfectly work together as sovereign countries for a common policy, not for Europe as such, but for what Xi Jinping calls the common aims of mankind, or the shared community for the future of humanity. And the new Silk Road would be the umbrella to work together, where all the European countries could in a win-win cooperation, cooperate with China in the development of all the other countries of Africa, of Southwest Asia. And if we would now quickly and rigorously implement the 4 laws of Linde-LaRouche, Glass-Steagall, a national bank, a credit system, a crash program to increase the productivity of the economy by turning it into a fusion economy as quickly as possible, and then cooperate for joint developments of the new Silk Road, it would be relatively easy and absolutely doable. But we have to mobilize the political will to do exactly that before it is too late.
There are two things that I think stand out that just need to be underlined. You used the term yesterday, the arrogance of power, that the bureaucrats in Brussels, the bankers from the City of London and Frankfurt seem to think that they know what they're doing, that they have the authority to carry out policies that have failed. And when the population votes against it, they say the people are wrong. So the second concept, I think, that you also brought up is the hypocrisy about democracy. People lecturing the Chinese and the Russians about democracy, when in fact, where you have a vote that goes against the elite, they try to overturn it. They're carrying out regime change now in the West, including in the United States. Helga, the one other thing on the question of related to Italy, you mentioned before this idea of contagion. The two most immediate places I can think of that could be affected, one is Spain, where there's a vote on no confidence for the prime minister tomorrow. The other is what's going to happen with the German banks if this Italian situation continues to cause chaos in the markets. So if you could just take up those two questions.
Well, there is a lot of talk about the state debt, public debt. Naturally, the German, the French, and the Belgian banks are the most affected by the Italian. They're holding Italian state bonds, but that is a relative minor problem as compared to the non-existent values of the derivatives. And Deutsche Bank is in a very difficult situation. They have a new head who is trying to get rid of the investment bank part of Deutsche Bank, but in the last 2 decades, that has become almost entirely Deutsche Bank. So I can only guess that to change that when Deutsche Bank has still a very large amount of so-called level 3 derivatives. These are derivatives which have no market value because they're essentially not sellable. So this could be a trigger for a major eruption of the crisis. I mean, Deutsche Bank stocks just fell below the psychologically not only psychologically but also economically critical point of 10 euro per share. So I think we are sitting on a complete powder keg. You have the Italian crisis, which is unresolved. The Greek situation is basically back on the agenda. There are big social unrests in Greece, also in France against Macron. You have a very unstable situation politically in Spain. Today is the vote, or tomorrow is the vote of no confidence. So that could also trigger developments. So then you have the corporate debt. So all the parameters are much worse than in 2008. And therefore, the urgency, given the fact that the European and the American banking system are absolutely interwoven and represent a cluster risk. Once you have a collapse at one point, it could quickly balloon into a complete meltdown of the system. So that, again, as I said, makes urgent the question of Glass-Steagall and the kinds of reforms which Mr. Rouge has been advertising for many years.
Now, another situation which seems to be moving in a relatively positive direction is the reopening of talks between North Korea and the United States. The South Koreans are involved, the Japanese are involved, and of course the Chinese are involved. There's talk that they may even revive the idea of the June 12th summit. What's the latest you have on the Korea situation?
Well, that looks indeed very promising, despite the efforts by the warmongering mainstream media, which ridiculed President Trump by having, the idea to postpone it, but putting it back on the agenda for June 12th soon thereafter. The situation looks very, very good. The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov is presently in North Korea and said that Russia would help to, make sure that the whole process of gradually denuclearizing and gradually lifting the sanctions, basically in harmony, which obviously requires a very good management and good diplomatic efforts. As you say, the Chinese are obviously involved. Also, Japan is very interested. And basically, in this process, President Moon from South Korea has really mediated a lot between North Korea and the United States. So I think there is the intention by all these people involved to make it a success. And our friends in South Korea are completely enthusiastic, and they tell us that the mood in the population is extremely happy about this process of potential unification with the North, and the promise of China, of Russia, of the United States to turn North Korea into a rich country by industrially developing it is also causing a tremendous mood of optimism in North Korea, so that our friends basically think it is completely impossible to reverse this, because for Kim Jong-un to not go in this direction when the whole population is in a spirit of joy and development is just very unlikely. And I think it's very important that obviously with the new Silk Road as an environmental framework for the North-South Korean developments, it is a completely different dynamic than you had it with the German unification, which was also a great promise. And, we called it the star hour of history, one of these rare moments where you can really change historical developments. But then we know what happened because of Bush, Thatcher, Mitterrand, the international banking system. This chance was missed because, they implemented shock therapy to the new states, the eastern states of Germany, that led to a complete deindustrialization from which the East has not recovered to the present day. And it came in the context of the general deindustrialization policies of the European Union implemented by Maastricht. So I think this Korean situation is much more hopeful than what turned out to be the consequence of the German unification, which is really a shame and needs inspiration. So maybe we can import the Korean spirit back to Germany.
Well, and that same network that you identified as running the operations against Germany is the grouping that's behind Russiagate and the efforts to tie Trump's hands and keep him pinned down and under the control of a neoconservative, neoliberal network. There's some developments around Russiagate with Charles Grassley, with the exposure of a triumvirate of MI6 CIA operations, including Mifsud and Downer and Halper. But where do you think things are going there? We're now in the second year of Mueller's investigation. What do you think has to be done to break this open? We just started circulating a new report calling for declassifying the documents. Would that create the effect that's needed, Helga?
Absolutely, because it is now becoming almost among certain circles a commonplace that this was a British coup. There is a very interesting article on the website of Pat Lang, basically saying the plot to slaughter the Trump presidency, where he says that it was British intelligence, it was the CGHQ Secret Service which did this. And, this is exactly what we have been publishing in two very important dossiers. And the moment these documents would be all declassified, you could have a complete catharsis and clean out the Augurian stable, of real bullshit or horse shit for that matter. And I think it's very important that this will all have legal consequences. Senator Grassley basically just announced that Glenn Simpson, the head of Fusion GPS, lied under oath when he was testifying in the Senate, because he claimed that Fusion GPS did not do any more investigation after the election. And now, because of FBI declassified files, it turns out that they were hired by a new group, Penn Quarter Group, to investigate Russian connections of Trump even after the election. And they were paid the not so peanut money of $50 million for it. So Glenn Simpson for sure will have some trouble for lying. And Senator Grassley also announced that next Tuesday, on June 5th, the General Inspector Horowitz, I think of the Department of Justice, will report on the findings of the investigation into the 2016 election campaign, including circumstances around Hillary Clinton's email, around Christopher Steele, and similar things. So I think, and that will be live streamed, by the way, for everybody to watch publicly. So I think there are still some surprises coming up. And as one former FBI member said, it will be worse. It will be far worse what will come out than what people expect. So I think this, as Trump would say, is a good thing and not a bad thing. And therefore, I would urge all of you who are watching this program, help us to spread it, help us to get involved in the solution, the battle for solution, to have a new economic program, the four laws of Zepp-LaRouche, to join the United States and Western European countries to join with the new Silk Road, because the solution is absolutely there, and mankind could absolutely create a new era of civilization if we clean out this Augurian stable and put some decent policies of win-win cooperation among sovereign nations on the table instead.
And I think these things are going to continue to come out because there's a whole more that's hidden, including the role of people like Brennan and Clapper. The Inspector General's report is going to focus a lot on Comey and McCabe. McCabe was he was fired in disgrace, and Comey, despite his attempt to do a book tour, is now looked at as a real sad sack. So this thing could break wide open and take these networks down with them. Now, Helga, to conclude, you mentioned the importance of the North Korea, the connection to the new Silk Road. There are new reports coming out on the new Silk Road influence in Africa that I think point to this tremendous dynamic potential of the new paradigm. And I think it'd be very useful for you to share a little bit of that with the viewers.
Well, there are new figures out what the Chinese investment and development in Africa has done in the last 10 years. And there is a new book out by a woman called Irene Yuan Sun about Africa to become the next factory of the world. And that is actually what now many people are starting to say, that due to the Chinese engagement in Africa, that Africa will be the new China of the coming period. And while I don't want to repeat all the figures here, but it's just very impressive. So China has created more than 100 industrial zones, 40% of which are already in operation, 5,756 kilometers of railway, 4,335 kilometers of motorways, 9 ports, 14 airports, 34 power stations, 10 large and about 100 small hydroelectric power stations already by 2016. And a lot more is going on now. So I think this is an absolute example that you can turn every poor country into a booming place if you have the political will. And there was just a very important conference in Beijing where the head of the International Red Cross basically pointed to the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road, has an incredibly stabilizing effect on war-torn regions of the world, of areas which are either threatened by terrorism or poverty or war, that the Belt and Road brings peace and stability. And I think this is also due to the fact that, or reflected in the fact that for the first time ever, China has exceeded the United States in terms of expectancy of a healthy life. I think the figures of this is that China is now expecting, I'm just trying to find my notes because I want to be precise. Well, I don't seem to have it here. In any case, I think the expectancy of every newborn baby in China to have a healthy life, that is other than total life expectancy, is 68.7, and the United States is 68.5%. Now, the total longevity is still a little bit longer in the United States, but it is collapsing, while in China it is increasing. And as we have said many times, life expectancy is one of the most important parameters which tells you something if an economy is developing in a good way or a bad way. These are figures by the World Health Organization, and I think it is really telling that we urgently must do something different in the West. I mean, there is now a very self-conscious discussion that the Chinese model is obviously doing much better than the Western model. And I think people should reflect on that. I'm not saying we need to copy it, but I think we should correct our own mistakes and go back to the traditions when we were functioning well. That is the American Revolution, that is Lincoln, John Quincy Adams, Roosevelt, Kennedy, in Europe, Adenauer, de Gaulle. I mean, there were periods where our countries were an example of brilliance, of science and technological progress. And, I think we really have to reflect on the fact that this push of the last 2 decades, or actually the last 50 years, but especially the last 2 decades in the neoliberal deregulation of the banking system, profit for profit's sake, at the expense of the general welfare, has been an utter mistake. It has alienated the people from the institutions, and it is reflected in these kinds of votes, what we see with the Brexit, what we see with the Italian vote, and this will, continue until we correct our mistakes.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. As you've been saying, catching the new Silk Road spirit is not just good for longevity, but it also makes you happy. It gives you a mission in life. And I think that's what the people who are watching this video and who are now working with the Schiller Institute are out in front of the rest of the population. And let's bring the rest of the population up with us. Spread the new Silk Road spirit. And Helga, thank you very much. And we'll see you again next week.
Yes, until next week.